Welcome to History at the OK Corral. Don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, leave us a comment down below, and share this episode with a fellow history lover. And now, on to tonight's episode. August 27th, 1776, New York, New York. The American War for Independence is at long last underway. The siege of Boston had lasted for nearly a year, as American and British forces, under their tactful generals, endeavored for control of the peninsular city. Ultimately, the British, unable to move beyond the city by land and cut off from supplies except as delivered by British ships which were constantly under varying degrees of harassment from American vessels, retreated from the Jewel of Massachusetts, sailing north to the friendly shores of Nova Scotia on St. Patrick's Day, March 17, 1776. A seminal moment that is still celebrated by the heavily Irish city today. After the withdrawal of British forces to the north, General George Washington, Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, marched his troops south to New York City, to the southern tip of the fast-developing island of Manhattan. The natural geography of New York City presented a multitude of opportunities for the Royal Navy, and Washington anticipated the British would value the vast harbor and waterways surrounding the city. Washington ascertained that if the British controlled the Hudson River, they could bifurcate the northern and southern colonies, and with innumerable loyalists populating the Empire State, it could spell disaster for the hopes of the young nation. He stated, "The Tories can only wait for a favorable opportunity to declare themselves openly." General Lee had preceded Washington's arrival in the Big Apple, having spent many sleepless nights trying to solve the tactical intricacies of the strategic Rubik's Cube that was New York's many waterways, harbors, islands, and land formations. He was so overwrought with anxiety and worry, as well as afflicted with an incapacitating case of gout, that Lee would be carried into the city on a stretcher. From there, he ordered artillery installations to be made at Governor's Island, Brooklyn's Red Hook, and Jersey City's Paulus Hook to defend against a British maritime invasion. Lee would profess the difficulties in defending New York to Washington in a letter. "What to do with the city I own puzzles me. It is so encircled with deep navigable water that whoever commands the sea must command the town." Both generals felt the city was indefensible should it be faced with the full might of the British Royal Navy. Yet Washington believed it would be utterly demoralizing to the troops, as well as the citizens, to simply surrender it without a fight. Prior to Washington's arrival in New York City on April 13th, the beleaguered General Lee was reassigned to Charleston, South Carolina, elevating Israel Putnam to Washington's second-in-command. As Washington toiled away in his office, maneuvering regiments, staffing officers, and delineating chains of command, he grew agitated with the administrative duties that kept him from being out in the field. He had stationed 121 cannons by early June upon Manhattan, Jersey Shore, Governor's Island, and Brooklyn, all angled to bombard approaching British vessels. The commander-in-chief also ordered the sinking of hulks into the offshore pathways and waterways the British were most likely to navigate, designed to tear into their hulls and make the other ships' approach to the city as undesirable as possible. Additionally, Washington ordered the construction of a series of strategically placed fortifications, namely Fort Washington and Fort Lee, positioned further up the Hudson with a desire to negate the British from creating a maritime passage to Canada upon the river. Fort Putnam, Fort Greene, and Fort Box were all constructed on the eastern side of the East River. These forts were enveloped by large trenches that connected them and brandished together a combined 36 cannons. While these defensive arrangements were being made, the city was gripped with a palpable sense of impending doom. Citizens attempted to go about their lives, but this dark cloud dampened their spirits and consumed their conversations. Adding to the uncertainty were the polarized allegiances of the city's residents, with patriots and Tories living as neighbors, as they all fervently waited for the axe of war to fall upon them. These divided citizens offered up strategic difficulties for Washington. As Washington took strenuous effort to conceal his plans, movements, and strategy from falling into British hands as best he could, a more nefarious plot was revealed when it came to light that local gunsmith Gilbert Forbes had been tasked with paying off turncoats and saboteurs, and that the money for these treasonous acts had been supplied by none other than the mayor of New York, David Matthews. Washington had Mayor Matthews arrested from his Flatbush home at 1 a.m, and, under interrogation, Matthews confessed that Governor Tryon had, quote, put a bundle of paper money into his hands. Over a dozen arrests were made as the city was gripped with rumors that Loyalists had attempted to poison Washington's food. The madness neared a fever pitch when a series of reprisals were leveled against the Tories, many of whom were tarred and feathered, others forced to ride the rail, straddling a fence rail carried by citizens, as an angry mob shouted them down, spat upon them, and threw blunt objects at them until they were carried to the edge of town and thrown down onto the hard ground. The fabled summer of 1776 was now underway. On June 29th, Patriot sentries that were stationed upon Staten Island sent word to Washington that 40 British ships had been spotted near Sandy Hook. British General Howe, Washington's antagonist during the siege of Boston, waited for the full brunt of his fleet to advance upon the city, and when the ships first appeared to the New Yorkers, cutting across the majestic blue waters beyond Manhattan, the residents of the town descended into hysteria, bustling about the town to make preparations for the coming onslaught. The moment they had unnervingly expected would not come at once, as they lived for weeks under this sword of Damocles. Howe had under his command an armada of 110 warships and transportation vessels, as well as 5,000 German mercenaries that brought his complete forces beyond 30,000 men. The stage was being set for the largest battle that would take place in all of the American Revolutionary War. While this imposing force cast its ominous shadow upon the city, Howe did not move toward an act of aggression at once. Instead, while some regiments of British troops made camp on Staten Island, as well as Gravesend, Long Island, Howe was content to wait until they had every ship available, with the rest of their fleet now being sailed under the command of his brother, Admiral Viscount Howe, across the Atlantic Ocean. Washington had been granted authority by Congress to recruit an army of 28,501 men, but only commanded 19,000 upon his arrival to New York. On top of this, the men were poorly trained, poorly disciplined, and at times poorly equipped. They'd made a habit of firing their muskets in camp. Fights frequently broke out amongst them, and they used their bayonets as though they were crude tools, often damaging them or simply not fashioning them back upon their firearms. The men had been instructed not to trample over the crops of farmers, but not all obliged this request. The most pressing issue was perhaps their frequenting of what was known as the Holy Ground, the infamous red light district where over 500 prostitutes plied their craft after sundown. Venereal infections soon plagued several regiments, diminishing what was already an undersized force. On July 12th, His Majesty's ships Phoenix and Rose sailed into the harbor towards the mouth of the Hudson. They were promptly fired upon from batteries within Fort George and Fort Defiance upon Governor's Island. The following day, Howe attempted to make an alternative approach, sending a diplomatic envoy with a message for Washington. The deliberations never even got off the ground, as the message was addressed to George Washington, Esquire. Refusing to acknowledge the Virginian's military rank, as he could only be officially viewed as a traitor to the crown, Washington's men refused the correspondence. When Howe tried again 3 days later, this time conferring the letter to George Washington, Esquire, etc., etc., as a semantic workaround for their opposing views, again, the letter was denied. With talks of a peaceful transition of the city to British rule now off the table, the looming possibility of battle had now become an inevitability. Washington had not changed his view in regard to his probability of successfully defending New York City, and instead focused on ensuring the victory for the Brits would come at a steep and bloody price. By the middle of August, roughly 25,000 British and German troops now made camp on Staten Island, or dined on dried pork rations upon the more than 400 transport ships in the lower bay. Of Washington's 20,000 men, due to detachments, illness, and infection, he could only muster a force roughly half that size for his impending clash with General Howe. 9,000 men were stationed within the city. 2,400 were garrisoned at Fort Washington, while 1,800 troops guarded King's Bridge at the northern tip of the island, the location of which was selected to defend against a Loyalist attack that may coincide with the British land invasion. Long Island happened to be one of the most poorly defended sites within the city at large. As soon as Greene would train his men on Long Island, Washington would undermine his progress by repositioning these men somewhere else within the city. This prevented the soldiers from formulating a cohesive understanding of the terrain. Just before dawn on the morning of August 22nd, 4,000 troops headed out from Staten Island under the command of Clinton and Cornwallis, making their way to Long Island. Within hours, all of the troops had landed without incident at Gravesend Bay. The Pennsylvania troops stationed there did not engage the British, and instead fell back, slaughtering livestock and torching homesteads along their way. When the sun had reached high noon that day, there were over 15,000 troops ashore, and with them, 40 cannons. They made their camp 6 miles in at Flatbush, as General Howe ordered they press on no further than that. When Washington received news of this landing, he was incorrectly told that the British force that landed numbered roughly 8,000 men. Washington believed this was a feint, designed to draw his forces away from the heart of the city, and he responded by sending just 1,500 additional reinforcements. The American forces on Long Island now numbered roughly 6,000, but the force they were set to oppose had not yet reached its full capacity. The following day, 5,000 German mercenaries joined their British counterparts, bringing the total size of this staunch detachment to over 20,000 men. Israel Putnam had been placed in charge of the American forces on Long Island. He was to command the force from Brooklyn Heights, while Sullivan and Sterling would lead the troops into battle just ahead from Guan Heights. There, the Guan Hills rose up from the ground over 50 meters high, and by stationing his troops here, Washington believed heavy casualties could be inflicted upon the British before the men ultimately withdrew back to Brooklyn Heights. There were 3 main routes that led to the Heights: Gowanus to the west, Flatbush Road to the east, and Bedford Pass beyond that. Sterling held the Gowanus Road with 500 men. Sullivan was to defend both Flatbush and Bedford with a combined force of almost 2,000 men. 6,000 men stood back at Brooklyn Heights as a reserve force and to receive the retreat from their brethren. Jamaica Pass was treated as an afterthought, with just 5 militiamen patrolling the area on horseback. Loyalists had informed British General Clinton of this nearly unguarded path, and plans were made to send a contingent of men on a night march through Jamaica Pass to open a flanking assault upon the Americans that would coincide with the forward assault launched by the mighty force that now occupied eastern Long Island. The night of August 26th, just after 9 p.m., Clinton began his march with a mobile force of infantrymen, and to his rear, Cornwallis brought an imposing detachment of 8 battalions and 14 cannons. Some 10,000 men made the march that night, the column stretching over 2 miles long. Just before midnight, the first shots were unleashed in the Battle of Long Island, as Samuel John Atlee's Pennsylvania regiment fired upon 2 straggling Redcoats near the Red Lion Inn. Clinton's movement was part of a devastating 3-pronged attack conjured by the British command to deceive, envelop, and then destroy the Continental Army. Major General James Grant would lead his Highlanders through Gowanus Road in a diversionary assault to the west of Brooklyn. Lieutenant General Leopold Philipp would march the Germans through Flatbush, turning through Brooklyn to arrive at Guana Heights. Howe's men would approach through Bedford towards Brooklyn, where Putnam and his defenses were stationed. This would completely ensnare the Americans stationed at Brooklyn Heights and would repel and expunge the ones stationed in the roads leading there along the way. Washington rode among his troops atop the Brooklyn Bluff and commanded to them, "Acquit yourselves like men, like soldiers, for all that is worth living for is at stake." To the south of Gowanus Creek, Lord Sterling led his 1,600 men through grueling combat for 4 hours that morning, while Washington observed through a scope. As the more than 7,000 British and German soldiers overpowered them, their inevitable defeat appeared to be at once coming to pass. Many Americans retreated back down the road towards Brooklyn, and as it appeared that Sullivan would be forced to flee or face his troops being entirely cut down, an unprecedented stand was made by the men of the 1st Maryland Regiment. Under the command of Colonel William Smallwood, they anchored their defenses against the fierce diversionary attack from Grant. In an effort to hold off the advancing enemy's approach to Brooklyn Heights, the men who would come to be known as the Maryland 400 thrust themselves forward in 6 successive catastrophic line charges into the teeth of the British front. The surviving member of the 5th Company recalled the shocking ordeal. "The enemy then advanced towards us, upon which General Lord Stirling immediately drew us up in a line and offered them to battle in true English taste. The British Army then advanced within about 300 yards of us and began a very heavy fire from their cannon and mortars, for both the balls and shells flew very fast, now and then taking off ahead. Our men stood it amazingly well. Not even one of them showed a disposition to shrink. Our orders were to not fire until the enemy came within 50 yards of us. When the British perceived we stood their fire so coolly and resolutely, they declined to come any nearer, although triple our number. In this situation, we stood from sunrise to 12 o'clock, the enemy firing upon us the chief part of the time. The heroic stand came at a heavy price. While numbers vary, it is estimated that over 250 of the men were cut down, with the survivors being captured and suffering an even worse fate, starved within the sordid underbellies of British prison ships and the waters surrounding New York City. Maryland adopts its Old Line State moniker from the brave undertaking these men gave forth on that late August day. Washington watched the valiant yet horrific stand made by the Maryland 400 and somberly remarked, "Good God, what brave fellows I must this day lose." The British did not want to deliver the decisive follow-up attack over open ground, fearing that they would suffer significant losses as they had under similar circumstances at Bunker Hill, and they began to dig a trench towards the Americans to advance under its cover. Washington would send for every ship, sloop, and seaworthy craft to chart the waters from Manhattan to their location in Brooklyn, and on the night of August 29th, as a handful of American militia kept several dozen campfires alight to give the appearance of a resting army, the revolutionary soldiers made their escape from Brooklyn Heights to the heart of the city in Manhattan. The operation was blessed with a dense fog that settled into the harbor, concealing the evacuation from the British patrols. As their forward scouts noticed there were no American pickets present, they investigated further, only to discover that the standing American army had vanished from Brooklyn Heights overnight. Just as they were discovering this shocking news, General George Washington was stepping onto the final Brooklyn ferry as the last American to do so. By 7 o'clock on the morning of August 30th, all 9,000 men arrived safely to Manhattan without a single loss of life in the exfiltration mission. Although Washington had decisively lost the Battle of Long Island due to the stout-hearted effort of the Maryland 400 and the surviving men's daring, clandestine retreat across the New York harbor, it was assured that the upstart army of the newly independent United States of America would live to fight another day. And fight they would. But the subsequent battles of the enduring war of attrition for the soul of America are for tonight, other stories for other times. Thank you for joining us on this episode of History at the OK Corral. Be sure to click the like button, share this episode with a friend, and become a subscriber. Also, if you'd like to support our work and gain early access to episodes as well as ad-free viewing, you can become a member of this channel by clicking on the join button below, or click the link in the description below to become a member on Patreon. Thank you again for watching, and we'll see you next time on History at the OK Corral, home of history's greatest shootouts and showdowns.